Well, it's the best Sunday school class in the building.
Yeah.
For sure. I don't know, when we joined the church 2 years ago, Martha was gonna show us 3 classes. So we started with the discovery class, never got beyond it, so, yeah, it was great, okay. All right, this is show and tell, and, I have here I think it's a 3-page, summary of, Billy's life, however many pages it is, about 5 maybe. And, I wrote this for the American National Biography and Encyclopedia series. They came out a couple years ago. And it's funny, they told me I said, how long do you want it? And they said, well, just write what you want to write. So first draft came out at 15 pages. And they said, no, we're looking more like 4. So we did some revising. But this is just, you can find a lot of summaries of Billy's life, but this was one that I put together. So we'll touch on some of the things that I want to talk about. Okay, now we have some show and tell. Okay. This is, let me tell you, I'll show you a couple books I wrote on Billy, and you can get them, hard copy, soft copy, online, Kindle, audio, Christian audio. But I'll make you a deal, and here's the deal. If you buy one, I'll take you out for coffee, okay? And, my royalty on that book is, $1.14, okay? So if I take you out for coffee, we're, yeah, maybe over at Esteem Coffee, it'd be cheaper than that. And royalty on this one, I think is $1.50, so it's still for coffee. All right. Seriousness aside, I don't believe in, any arrangements with church folks and dear friends that you make profit on. This is the first book I did, and it's called America's Pastor, Billy Graham and the Shaping of a Nation. It's very long and very tedious, my family tells me. And I gave a copy to my stepfather, who is now gone, and he worked for FAA in North Dakota, and he was a Navy man before that. So I gave a copy to him. And about a month later, I called him up and asked him, if he'd had a chance to look at it. He says, yeah. I said, what do you think? And he says, I'm halfway through the first chapter and there's no relief in sight. So it could be that it's slow going, I don't know. But yeah, it's written for academic audience. What is written for, shall I say, normal people? Is this one soul at a time. And this is the one that, if you have any interest in Billy, I would recommend. And the subtitle is The Story of Billy Graham. And by the story of Billy Graham, I do mean that quite literally, in that the structure of this book is that I try to tell the story of his life as I think he would have. Now, I add a few things that he might have forgotten, but basically, I just sat down and thought, I know him well enough that I think I can generate an idea what he thought would be important and what the sequencing would be. So anyway, that's what that is, the one soul at a time. And I think it's very interesting. I haven't time to tell you this, but this title comes from an article in the Charlotte Observer by Ken Garfield, and Ken Garfield is Jewish. And he had no intentions, he's a good friend, he had no intentions of becoming a Christian, but he admired Billy a great deal. And the story behind that is Billy's last crusade in Charlotte, and there were the usual 80,000 people in the stadium, and he was at that time 88 years old. And Ken was down, on the main floor, and he said the sun was shining through. It was about 6 p.m, and the sun was shining through, and there was this, great mane of silver hair, and the sun was shining through it. And so he said, and so there was the patriarch standing before 80,000 people, still calling for one soul at a time. And I thought that was really wonderful. Okay, and the book has been translated into Portuguese, so I'm sure you'll want a copy of that. And actually, a couple translated in Korean and Hindi, and And, Kathy's still working on those, okay. All right, now, one more, and I can't make you any promises about, free coffee for this one. It's called An Odd Cross to Bear, and the biography of Ruth Bell Graham. Written by Ann Wills, who is a historian, teaches at Davidson College. She was my student, I'm very proud to say. And amazingly, this is the first biography of, I mean, there have been some popular ones, but this is the first serious biography of Ruth Graham. And it's very even-handed. It's sympathetic, but it's still even-handed. And I'll just a side story. When I started this project, it was 14 years ago or something, early on, Kathy and I had dinner with Jean and Leighton Ford. And Jean was Billy's sister. And she just died 2 weeks ago. She was 92. And so I was telling Jean what I was trying to do. And very early on, she said, well, what are you writing about Ruth? And I said, well, you know, I hadn't planned to write anything about Ruth. She said, you cannot tell my brother's story unless you tell Ruth's story. Because Jean said, Ruth was there every step of the way, every minute of the way, right behind him. And these are one stories. Well, yeah, I can only narrate one at a time, but it is true that Ruth was a remarkable woman. She died in 2007. And not so way, she was the power behind the throne. I'll just say a word about Ruth right now. She was a little bit younger than Billy, maybe 1 year. And she was more conservative than he was, both theologically and politically. In fact, quite a bit more conservative. She had a great sense of humor. I mean, she was just notable for her sense of humor. And I would say, without almost any question, she was smarter than Billy. And everybody would say that. I mean, she was just lightning quick with her wit. And so she's a delightful person to know about. Okay, excuse me. Important person to know about. Well, I want to thank you all for coming, obviously. And, you know, perfectly good spring night, you know, and you're here. And so I'm really honored that you would do this. My format, excuse me, I just get so choked up. My format, and our format will be trying to start promptly at 6. And yeah, thanks. Thank you, Maria. Okay. And we'll quit by 6:50. This story could go on, you know, I mean, we could do, you know, a 10-week, you know, an entire semester if you want to do that, which you're not going to do. There's a ton of stuff to talk about, but we'll quit by 6:50, and I'll try to leave some time because I'm sure you'll have questions. And I want discussion. I want you to think about it as a class. So let's just have a discussion about the things I'm going to try to talk about. That's some ideas about the reading. Now let me talk about some other reading. If you wanted to break out beyond, you know, the Wacker circle here, there are about 20 biographies of Billy Graham, and they range from fawning to demonizing. And you would not believe the degree of both. There are people out there who think he could do absolutely no wrong, no matter what he did. They would defend him to the end. There was one woman, in fact, who heard that Billy Graham was having trouble with his eyes. And this was when he was about 80. He was having trouble with his eyes, and she wrote in and she offered her eyes to him. I mean, that's the degree of loyalty, if that's the word you want to use. Another woman attended every meeting he preached at in a 65-year ministry, all around the world. And these are talking about hundreds and hundreds of meetings that she followed. That's at one end. At the other end is the demonizing, and there were plenty of people out there who despised him and some hated him. And the Billy Graham organization has a file this fat of death threats. And I've seen some of those death threats. People wrote in threatening to kill him, threatening to kill Ruth, to kill his children, I mean, even to kill his dog. And Billy was a great lover of dogs, and he had a couple of great St. Bernards, you know, to kill his dog. And so at that point, they put an iron fence all around his home just because there were so many death threats. So you know why? I mean, just turn off the radio, just don't look at him, but I mean, why people would have that degree of antagonism, or for that matter, on the other side, well, how they would have that degree of love, so there's a great range, in the stuff that's been written about him, but if you wanted to pursue beyond what I've written, then I can suggest any number of books that I think are very responsible. The standard book is by a guy named Bill Martin, who used to teach at Rice University. He's probably about 90 now. And a wonderful, wonderful biography. I learned a ton from him. It's 870 pages. That might be more than you want to know about Billy Graham. But anyway, that's pretty much the standard view. Now, you have a right to know what I think about him before I start. Everything comes from a point of view, so here is my point of view. The short of it is, I think he was a great man. I admire him tremendously. I learned a lot in the years I spent working on him. At the same time, he was human. He had character flaws, and he made some mistakes. There's just no question about that. And his sister, Jean, can offer some of his mistakes beyond what I would say. I mean, he was human. And so on the whole, I would say he certainly was a great man, and he contributed enormously to the faith that we all love, to the church. He was without question, he was an evangelical, and we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But I mean, what he contributed to the evangelical tradition in the church. But he also repelled some people by mistakes he made, and I'm just going to try to be honest about that with you all. I'm going to break what's left into two parts. When Kathy and I lived in Massachusetts, there was a grizzled old guy that lived next to us, and he told me this. He says, Grant, he said, there are two kinds of people. And I said, well, what's that? Uncle George, what's that? And he said, well, there are people who go around saying there are two kinds of people, and those who don't. So that's where we are tonight. We're going to make two parts to what I'm going to try to do. And the first part, it's just a basic chronology, and it's summarized in that document I wrote. But I want to hit the mountaintops is all, and so you have some sense of what's coming. And then in the second part, I would like to talk about his influence. Why would we ever want to sit in here and listen to him? I mean, listen to someone talking about him. So basic chronology and influence. Next week, I discuss character. There I'm going to take on, questions of, he was both an extraordinarily humble man and also a vain man. And how do you put those things together? Well, a lot of us, I mean, we have contradictions in our lives, and so I want to get into the questions of his character, and then finally his legacy, what he has left us in American Christianity, and very importantly in world Christianity. This is one of the stories that I can't tell you very much about. Well, I could, but I mean, there's so much more to the story. But that's the next great book that needs to be written, is Billy Graham Overseas, because that was the last third of his ministry. Most of his meetings were outside the US and Canada. Okay, born in 1918 and died in 2018, and just a few months short of 100. He was determined to make it to 100, and he didn't quite do that. He lived in Montreat, North Carolina, and actually really did live there. 80 of those almost 100 years. He was in Montreat. He was born in Charlotte, and I'll get to that in a minute. But his sister once told me that he went back to Charlotte for the food, but he went up to Montreat for the repose. That's pretty good, and he had to get away from people. And if you haven't seen it, well, you cannot go up to his house anymore. I think they're going to turn it into a state historical landmark, what they're working on. But he was on top of a mountain, and you wind around, run around to get up to the top. And Ruth built it. pretty much at the beginning of their marriage. And it was extremely remote at the time, and it still is, and grand view. Contrary to what was said in some newspapers, it was not opulent. It was a nice house, no question about that. But, it wasn't remotely what it could have been. But it was a nice house up there. And this was his home for most of his adult life, the place that he would retreat to. He was born on a farm near Charlotte, and it was a farm that was quite a ways out of Charlotte, and I've gone by there, and my sister was taking me there actually, and she said they would go an entire day and not see a car. So this is how rural it was. His father, William Graham Sr., was a farmer, and his younger brother was a farmer, Melvin. He was a farmer. And so Billy very much grew up in a farming environment. Now, as he grew older, he wrote and said that there were two occupations he would never go into. First, he would never be a mortician, and second, he'd never be a farmer. And he said, I hate farming. And I grew up that way. I grew up milking cows at 3 o'clock in the morning. Never again. I'm not even going to come close to cows again. So, the part of that that's really more important is that he was a Southerner. And to the end of his life, he was always very proud of saying, I'm a Southerner. And if the audience was appropriate for it, he'd say, I'm from North Carolina. And I've listened to tapes of his talks, and he wasn't dissimulating. He really was proud of being from North Carolina. I'll skip ahead of it and say that at one point, Our State magazine took a survey of the most beloved people in the state of North Carolina. And as you might guess, Billy Graham came out way ahead as the most beloved. You want to guess who the other two were, the top three?
Jesse Holmes.
No, I mean, he might have been 5 or something, Guess who yeah. Well, number 2 was Andy Griffith. Yeah. And then, Dean, you'll know this. I mean, Neil, Dean Smith. Yeah. Wonderful group, isn't it? Billy Graham, Andy Griffith, Dean Smith. All right. So he was a Southerner and a man who never really, he didn't transcend those roots. He didn't want to transcend those roots, with one exception, and that is that when he was talking personally, and there was not a microphone or a crowd of tens of thousands out there, he had a deep Southern accent, almost a drawl. But when he got behind a pulpit, especially when he's preaching in New York City, that Southern accent disappeared. So he knew how to adjust. He grew up in an upper middle class family. His father was the most prosperous farmer anywhere in the region. They're first people in the area to have a telephone, the first people to have a car, and he was quite upfront about that. He did not suffer as a young man. They weren't rich, but he certainly didn't suffer. He went to college for one semester at Bob Jones, and you all know about Bob Jones College. Now, it is now in Greenville, South Carolina, but in those days it was in Cleveland, Tennessee. And he didn't really want to go to Bob Jones, but his mom did. And his mother controlled a lot that happened in that family, put it that way. And so he went to Bob Jones, and he hated it. And, the climate in Cleveland, Tennessee was not what he wanted. And he loved warm climate and beaches and all this, and that wasn't. But he very quickly grew to strongly dislike Bob Jones, who was, by his portrait, a tyrant, and especially the way that the school was run. And as he tells the story, he went in to see Dr. Jones when he decided he was going to leave after a semester. And Dr. Jones informed him that he would never amount to anything if he left the college. What he did, he went ahead, he left the college, and he went to a little Bible institute near Tampa called Florida Bible Institute. Very happy there. There's a river right next to it and a golf course. And there are alligators in the river. And he'd go down, the riverbank and he'd preach to the alligators. He said they're the best audience at all. They never talked back. He learned his craft. He learned how to preach. And a lot of times, the preachers, including Billy, would give you the impression that this is all just the Holy Spirit. I just walk up to the pulpit and the Holy Spirit fills my mouth and, well, I'm not going to judge what the Holy Spirit was doing, but what I will say is that he worked very hard to learn to preach. He stood in front of mirrors. He had people listen to him, and he took the art of preaching extremely seriously. And he learned that at Florida Bible Institute. There for 3.5 years, he had a sense he needed more education. And long story, which I won't get into, he then transferred to Wheaton College, just outside of Chicago. And that's a whole story in itself. Wheaton College was, as they said in those days, the Harvard of the Christian colleges, and in lots of ways it still is. In fact, the joke is that Harvard is the Wheaton College of the Ivy League. It is a tough school to get into, and it's an even tougher school to get out, and it's expensive. Like all schools like that, you got a scholarship. And at Wheaton, a couple things happened. One is he met Ruth, and he said that when he met Ruth, she looked like a starlet. All right. And by all accounts, if you look at the pictures in here, by all accounts from the press, that she was an extraordinarily attractive young woman. The other thing at Wheaton College is that he did not major in Bible. He did not major in theology, as you might guess, but rather he majored in anthropology. Why is that? Because he knew early on that he'd want to preach around the world. And had a sense that you take anthropology, you might be able to relate to people outside the American context. I'll skip ahead a bit to say that they were married a month after they graduated, and eventually had 5 kids, and you all have heard of Franklin, and that's a whole other story. Franklin, as I will say, I think does extremely good work with Samaritan's Purse, and I wish he would not get into politics. In fact, one time, I'll just say, Kathy and I went up to visit Samaritan's Purse and had a nice tour, and before leaving, we had lunch with the number 2 person, and at the end, he leaned down and he said to us, if Franklin would stay out of politics, he would go down as one of the great humanitarians of the 20th century. And I think that's absolutely true. Anyway, there are 4 additional kids, and one of them lives in Raleigh, and then a couple more daughters, and then one who spent his entire life in Seattle. I've never met him, but I am told he was quite intentional about spending his life in Seattle. Everybody else, North Carolina, wanted an independent life. Getting out of Wheaton College, Billy went to work for Youth for Christ. Now, Youth for Christ is moribund now. It still exists, but it's moribund. But what it was in the 1940s was an independent organization. They call them parachurch organizations, all right? P-A-R-A. And it was an independent organization designed to provide a spiritual home for returned servicemen and women, but they were overwhelmingly male. And what they sensed is that during World War II, these guys are coming back, and on Saturday nights they misbehaved, all right? But they had no place to go. And so Youth for Christ became a venue for these men, and it began to attract other young people. And Billy worked as an itinerant evangelist for Youth for Christ. That was his first job. And he did that for 4 years after he graduated. His first big exposure was in 1949, the crusade in Los Angeles, downtown, the very heart of Los Angeles, where he or people who worked with him pitched a tent, a huge circus tent. Now, Billy was always extremely smart, extremely canny about how to attract people. And he knew you put a tent in the center of Los Angeles and had these great carbon arc lights that scan the ceiling. People are going to start coming. What is this? All right. And they started to come almost immediately, but it was fairly slow. And after about 3 weeks, he decided he was going to pack up and go home. Just wasn't enough people to make it worthwhile. But then something happened after 3 weeks. And depending on your point of view, it was fortuitous or miraculous. William Randolph Hearst heard about this crusade downtown. And William Randolph Hearst owned a chain of newspapers across the United States. He was by far the biggest newspaper owner. He was by no means an evangelical. I think he was, formally an Episcopalian, but I mean, he had very little church connection. It wasn't a theological draw. Rather, Hearst was extremely shrewd. He knew how to sell newspapers. So he told his reporters, feature Billy Graham. Get down there and watch what's going on and then write stories, and I will put him on the front page. And he did. Billy was very honest about it. To the end of his life, he said he owed his career to William Randolph Hearst. Later on, he became very close to Henry Luce. And the same kind of deal. Henry Luce owned Time Magazine and Life Magazine, Sports Illustrated, Fortune, and a couple more. And Luce liked him a lot and put him on the cover of Time Magazine over and over. So Billy had a very shrewd sense of how to market himself, through the press. A couple more things happened in Los Angeles that catapulted him into the national eye. The first, which isn't something that he was able to control, but it happened there, is that he was extraordinarily handsome. And over, the press would comment on this Clark Gable kind of guy who was preaching in this circuit tent downtown. And when Billy died, I made a point to look at what was in the obituaries. And virtually every obituary said something about his looks. And in fact, the obituary in Newsweek, is a word for word, the first sentence of the article in Newsweek was, his face is Hollywood handsome. He knew it. And if you go down to the organization in Charlotte today, you'll find they have more than 1 million photos. And he posed for an awful lot of them. Now, he was asked by pressmen who asked one of his associates, what does God think about, good looks? And the associate said, well, it's not that God is impressed by good looks, but he said, good looks reduces resistance. Huh? And it's very shrewd. You get up there and you're handsome and people, nice to the eye. So that is a part of Billy's career. And he was always very trim. He was 6'2", weighed 180 pounds. He was a nut about exercising, about jogging, lifting weights, running. So he was very aware of the appearance part. Second thing that happened in Los Angeles that was very important is that people found out about his preaching style. Never went to seminary, but he had a unique preaching style, which you can see on television, although it's somewhat toned down later on in television. But when he started out, his one article, one newspaper said that he was trumpet lunged. He had tremendous volume and preached at tremendous speed. And newspaper stenographers tried to write down, this is a day before these things are often recorded, so they tried to write down his sermons, and they typically clocked him at about 240 words a minute. Now there's a man who's preaching fast, okay? And he always enunciated, he never stumbled. And see, this is remarkable. There's a Southern farm kid who could preach that fast and never stumbled. His grammar was perfect. So there's a lot of very interesting things about the preaching style. Another thing that happened, yeah.
How old was he then?
Well, he was born in 1918, this is 1949, so he would have been right about 30, yeah. And he didn't have a bass voice, but he had an appealing baritone voice, and people talked about that it was just nice to listen to, and then attractive to look at. The third thing about him is that he preached for a decision. No bones about it. He didn't pretend to be an exegetical preacher. He didn't preach an exegetical sermon in his life. He said, I preach for a decision. And he said, every sermon is ultimately about John 3:16. And in fact, one of his associates later on, he preached thousands of times in his life. And the associate said, if you heard Billy preach 10 times, you've heard them all. And now it isn't tough to understand because he's always preaching for a decision. And one thing, well, a lot of things he really strongly disliked, but one thing that he extremely strongly disliked is drifting. Don't drift. Make a decision, and he would say it over and over, call it. And if you want to call it by not being a Christian, okay. That's not what we're here for, but if you just make that decision, this isn't for me, then fine, call it. But if you decide that you wish to be a Christian, then step forward or in some way, make that a visible part of your life. So, his first radio program, which I'll get you in a second, was called what? The Hour of Decision. His television program, started 4 years later, was called The Hour of Decision. His magazine was called what?
Decision.
You're getting the idea. Decision. This sense of the necessity of coming clean on who you are. And that's part, a lot of Billy I admire a great deal. I don't admire everything, but that's part of what I really do admire, is that we don't want people just drifting. One other thing happened in Los Angeles, and this is the last thing, is that he acquired a team. The first member of the team, as you all probably know about, is George Beverly Shea. His songster was a Canadian, and Shea had his own life, his own career. He sold millions of records and ponderous vocals, reverent, and people loved him. I mean, he was a phenomenon in himself. And Billy knew that. He knew how important Shea was, and that people came to the meetings for music, in part. He knew that, okay? And so he always, that is Billy, always made sure that a good part of every meeting was given over to Shea. And Billy himself didn't have, he couldn't sing. Shea said of him, he said, Mr. Graham has the malady of no melody. That was true. I mean, he said it. And so when he hired Shea to come along, his deal, well, Shea said, I'm not a preacher. And Billy said, well, I'm not a singer. So they made a deal that Billy would never try to sing and Shea would never try to preach. And so it was a great combination. Second person that he brought on board was Cliff Barrows. Cliff orchestrated, he was a choir director. He was superb at this skill. But he also ran the meetings. He was the voice behind everything. He was the power. He was the one who understood all about crusades. And Billy was smart enough to turn everything over to Cliff Barrows. Now, this is a sideline. Talk about another occasion. Billy knew what his gift was. And he said, I do what only I can do. I preach. Now, other people could preach, but he was very honest about it. He said, people don't come to hear other people preach. They come to hear me preach. But everything else, he turned over to people who are superb at their job. And Cliff Barrows was the one who directed the choir and then who ran the meetings. One other person who was not as visible and is very much alive and I love dearly is Leighton Ford. Leighton is 92. He was Jean's husband. And Leighton was the backup preacher. And Billy's human. He couldn't preach every time. He'd get sick or the plane would, be deflected. So there had to be someone else. And Leighton Ford preached like Billy. He had a voice that was very similar and had the same style. Another Canadian. This is an interesting story in itself. Almost all of the people that he hired and were part of his team were Canadians. And I'll get way off track. Leighton is 92 and he's been in the U.S. now for about 70 years and he still has the joint citizenship. And he told me just recently, he said, I still don't understand American politics. That's after 70 years. I said, well, I can't say that I do either. Okay. That was 1949. Then the next year, Billy launched a radio program. Hour of Decision, the first nationally syndicated religious radio program. It was all over the United States. 2 years later, he did something that always paid off in a big way. He put himself on a publicly stated salary. Now, what was happening in his meetings, they were passing the hat. And he said, I'm getting paid way too much. Now, we don't know what it was, but he said, I'm getting paid way more than I should be. And then the press would criticize him by saying, so he goes into these counties to milk them. So he figured out, all right, I'll solve that problem. He put himself on a publicly stated, publicly audited salary, and at that time it was $15,000 a year. That was good. I mean, it was generous, but it wasn't anything close to the money that he could have brought in. 2 years after that, first big crusade overseas in London, 1954. And this is where he became a kind of an international celebrity. As I say, that's a whole nother story, the international Graham. But he came to believe that a part of his calling was international as a result of that crusade in London. 2 years later, Billy founded a magazine, and the magazine is called Christianity Today. We have it in the library down here. It is the voice of evangelicalism and for a lot of other people in America. And the reason he founded Christianity Today is that he said, preaching, this is his word, is evanescent. It comes and goes. A magazine, locks it in. It's a reference point. So he had this sense that he needed a magazine. And he got an academic, whose name was Carl Henry, to edit it. Carl Henry, that's a whole nother story. Carl Henry was a heavy-going theologian, and he had the first article in Christianity Today. And Billy wrote him afterwards, and he says, "Dear Carl, thank you for what you did." But he said, "I think you confuse obscurity for profundity." A great line. And so, they loosened up. And Christianity Today now has more than 5 million discrete visits a month. Okay. So you got a magazine. Then the next biggest and by far the most visible crusade that he ever ran was in New York City in 1957. 16 weeks in the summer of 1957, he preached every single night except Monday for 16 weeks. And later on, he would say that his body never recovered what that took out of him. But he became an international celebrity as a result of that meeting. And it was in that meeting, a couple things happened. One is, I became a media personality across multiple venues, ABC News, NBC News, CBS News. They began following him. That's when Time Magazine, Life Magazine began following him. That's when he started appearing on the covers of these magazines, and I counted 32 covers myself. And again, most of those covers, they're just kind of a Clark Gable look. And when he was 70, it was a fantastic photo on the cover of Newsweek. He's wearing a black turtleneck, his silver hair, and it's called, the caption is called A Lion in Winter. A Lion in Winter. And he did. He had this commanding visage on this cover. Well, he became this kind of international celebrity at New York, 1957. 2 other things happened, important for us to know. One is he looked out on the audience there. It's in Madison Square Garden, night after night, every single seat taken. And I was there, I was 12 years old, still remember it. Every single seat taken, Madison Square Garden, 18,000 seats. And he looked out on that congregation and he said, they all look like me. Every single face out there is white. And so that's when he determined that he was going to amplify the reach. He went into Harlem, he went into Brooklyn, he invited Martin Luther King to come and speak one night, offer a prayer. King did. It was a pretty tepid prayer, and Billy's thank you was pretty tepid. They never made it together. The reasons for that. It was a testy relationship. But at least Billy was trying, to expand the scope of his ministry. The other thing that he did is that he determined to reach out to the main line, to so-called liberals. He was not going to be restricted to conservative churches, evangelical churches. He would reach out to people across the theological aisle from him. And his line was, if they don't ask me to change my message, and if they accept the deity of Christ, I will work with anyone. Just two things. I'll work with anyone, anywhere, if you just those two criteria. Well, that expanded his appeal, obviously, but it also did something else you might not expect. It alienated fundamentalists, because they believed that anybody who works with the main line has sold out. And mostly, what the fundamentalists were most angry about was that Billy was determined to work with Catholics. And this is a very important part of the story, is the support from Catholics. Everywhere he went, the Catholics supported him. There were some exceptions, but on the whole, Catholics supported him, and he worked with Catholics. He became friends with the Pope. The last time he was with us, it was John Paul II. And the last time he was with John Paul II, he said, when I had left, John Paul linked his thumb with my thumb. And he said, we are brothers. Huge opposition to this. Now, nowadays, the time that we're in, we don't think about that for the most part. The Catholics are the enemy. But in those days, Catholics were the enemy. And I grew up in a fundamentalist home in Missouri, being taught that, yeah, there will be some Catholics in heaven. It'll happen, there'll be some here and there. There'll be a sprinkling of them. The hostility was just so big you could cut it. It really just cut it. So those are the things that took place in New York. I'll say only two more things about the life, and I lost control of my time because I do want to talk about the influence. Two more things about his life is that he went to Moscow in 1982 to attend a conference that was sponsored by the Russian Orthodox Church. And it was supposedly a conference for disarmament. And it turned out to be a charade. And everybody knew it was going to be a charade. And Billy ran into a firestorm of opposition for going to this disarmament conference. Now, first, let me tell you what he did. He went, he spoke only once. But the conclusion of his sermon was this way. He said, the United States and the Soviet Union are like two little boys standing in a bathtub full of gasoline and playing with matches. And he said, folks, this is exactly what he said. We are going to annihilate civilization as we know it. So this was a call. This was a man who was very afraid of communists over much of his life. And yet by then, he had this sense that he would throw his weight behind mutual nuclear disarmament. Well, there was a huge amount of opposition to this. When he went, his organization urged him not to do it. George Bush was president of the United States. George Bush called him up and said, don't do it. George Bush was vice president. Ronald Reagan, president, called him up and said, don't do it. Ruth said, don't do it. His wife. Now look, if Catherine told me not to go to Harris Teeter, I wouldn't do it, right? You think about the level of opposition. Your wife tells you, don't do this. Solid wall of opposition. And until 2:00 a.m. the night before, he didn't go. And he said, I prayed and prayed and prayed. He said, fine. I had to do it. The Holy Spirit was telling me to do it. Well, he came home, and immense blowback for coming home when he came home. George Will of the Washington Post. And George Will is an atheist, but and politically conservative. And he wrote in the Washington Post, he said, Billy Graham is America's most embarrassing export. He said, we don't know which is greater, his naivete or his vanity. That's the front page of the Washington Post. Then it went down from there. And I made a point to that stuff, and it's enormous. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Later, Dan Rather was one of them. And when Billy was approaching his end, Dan Rather came forward on CBS News, and he said, I was wrong. Billy Graham was right. He saw the threat on the horizon. Now, I'm not saying it's because of him that we started disarmament, but I'm saying that he contributed to it. The second thing that happened was not as positive in the long run, but it depends on how you view it. He had a conversation with Richard Nixon in 1972 in the Oval Office, which was taped. As we know, Nixon was taping everything. And Nixon started a tirade about Jews and what a menace Jews are. And I won't reproduce in this room the language that Richard Nixon used, but it was about as vile as you can imagine. And Billy was sitting there, and instead of challenging him or even challenging the language, he went along with it. And he said, yeah, I agree. You know. Now, if you listen to the tape very carefully, it does appear that what Billy was referring to was the media, Jews who controlled the media, not Jews in general. But it didn't really matter in that, you know, he was targeting a large number of Jews. And what he said, what the killer line was, that he said, a lot of them seem to be my best friends, but they don't know how I really feel about them. That's on tape. That conversation in 1972, when the Nixon tapes came out in 2002, there it was. At first, Billy couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that that was him. But after 3 days of listening to the tape over and over, he came forward and he said, yeah, that was me. And he said, there's no way I can apologize enough for the he used the term unforgivable things that I said that day. And a few weeks later, he went to Cincinnati to Hebrew Union College University in the seminary. And there was a gathering of rabbis, and he walked into the room of rabbis. And many of them sat and clapped. And he said, don't clap for me. He said, I'm the one who should be begging for forgiveness. Now I have to say, he did see, he fessed up. He made a huge mistake. He fessed up to it. I admire that part. I've written, and some people won't agree with me, but I don't think that conversation had a thing to do with Jews. There's not an anti-Semitic bone in his body. What it was about was his obsequious relationship with Richard Nixon. Anything that Nixon had said, he would agree with. And later on, he said that. He said, you know what it's like to be in the Oval Office of the President of the United States? The President is just treating you like an equal, and you know, you're just rolling along in a conversation. He said, that's what happened to me. So, big mistake, a flaw, major error. And I would say in his entire career, that is the most conspicuous error that he made. Apologized as much as a human being could. Two other kinds of big errors he totally avoided. One is he was faithful to his wife. He had countless options to not be faithful. Man, it looks like he did 8 months a year on the road. And there is no evidence of any sort that he ever veered off track. He talked about it. He said, you know, there are temptations out there. But he said, that's just not where I'm going to go, not what I'm going to do. The second place where he never made a mistake, as far as I know, is with money. Never misused money. He clung to his vow that every cent that came in would be publicly audited and accounted for. So, what are the two big mistakes evangelists make? Marital and money. And those are the two that he avoided. I'm going to obviously compress what I want to say about his influence. Here's a potpourri of the influence of the man. Gallup poll from 1956 to the present, every year has had a survey of the most admired man and the most admired woman. And for 61 consecutive years, Billy was on that list. Now, 61 times. The next closest person was Ronald Reagan, who appeared on that list 33 times. Jimmy Carter appeared 27 times. John Paul II appeared 27 times. So in other words, twice as often as any other person, Billy appears on this list of most admired man. And even after this terrible, revelation about the Jews, he's still on the list. Most admired man. That's one of the indications of his popular appeal. The second is people have quantified, his organization have quantified the number of people he spoke to. And they, in pretty good ways of quantifying this, turnstile counts and with helicopters overhead that took photographs, and they, some poor graduate student somewhere was charged with the task of, counting every single person. And the tally was 77 million people in person. And then if you add to that live feed, not television, but live feed, people who are watching remotely, you add to that and 138 million, and so you get a total of 215 million people heard him preach. I can't say with absolute certainty that that's more people than any other person. John Paul II was heard by about that many people. So if we set aside John Paul II, more people heard Billy Graham proclaim the gospel than any other person in history. Over the course of that ministry, he received 3 million decision cards. That is, in the meetings, they would ask for people to come forward and sign a card. No, decision card. And there are more than 3 million of them. And then toward the end of his life, reporters would ask him, what are you most proud of? He always had the same answer, those decision cards. And reporters once asked him, there was an enormous amount of money that went into these meetings. Was it worth it? And his answer was the same. He said that there was only one decision card. It would have been worth it, my entire career. So that gives you a sense of the scope. A couple more indicators of the scope. He was friends with 10 presidents in a row. 12, he knew 12 presidents in a row personally, and he was friends with 10 of them. The first president that he knew was Truman, Harry Truman, and the last one was Obama. He was only with Obama 30 minutes, so you can't really say that they were friends. And Obama made the pilgrimage up to see Billy when he was running for office. Obama was. Truman was a different matter. Truman despised him, and Truman was very clear about it, that he didn't like Billy, and he said that he was just another street corner Bible banging fundamentalist. And Truman had more colorful language as well that I won't use. So they didn't get along, but that's a whole other story. So, but every other president, he was very close to 4: Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and the senior Bush. My own judgment is that his closest friend, except for Cliff and George Beverly, except for them, his closest friend in the world was Lyndon Johnson. It's hard to imagine two people more unlike, right? And let's say Lyndon Johnson did not sail his ship all that close to home. And I was like a notorious philanderer. And Billy knew it. And counseled him. He said, Lyndon, you're gonna pay for this. The Lord is seeing what you're doing. And Lyndon Johnson was stormed, he's always contrite about it. But can't help it. Okay. But in other ways, they were close, and I've seen the letters, the exchanges. And not rarely, Johnson would conclude his letters saying, Billy, I love you. And Graham would say the same back. Lyndon, first name basis, President of the United States, I love you. And one touches me at one point, Lyndon Johnson wrote, he says, Billy, do you know how lonely this job is? Well, Billy did. And very often, in fact, Billy stayed in the White House more than 25 times, and a good part of those were during Lyndon Johnson's presidency. He was friends with the first ladies, that's another story. Ruth was close to the first ladies, that's a whole other story. Let me give you just a couple more indications of the extent of Billy's popular appeal. And these are letters that he received. Over the years, he received millions of letters. And the great majority of them were destroyed, had to be, they didn't have room for them. But they did keep several hundred, over the years, and they have them in the Graham archives. And Kathy went with me, and was it 3 summers we went up there? And we just sat there and we read these letters. And they're harder to read than you think because the handwriting, was tough. But we sat there, day after day, it was 3 weeks in each summer, reading those letters and taking notes. You can't photocopy them, you have to take notes on them. And they're heartbreaking, great man. I mean, just, don't know the word, they just break your heart. But the common theme that comes through over and over and over went like this. My life was off track. I'd gone off the rails, and then you came to town. And it was just so common. And that touched me, as you can tell. Children's letters are the ones that I think I like the most. And they're the same, I can go on with them. I persuaded my wife, in fact, to co-author a small article with me some years ago about children's letters, and 2 children's letters that I especially like. One, Dear Billy, adults usually call him Dr. Graham, adults and children. Dear Billy, long letter from a first grader, and it came out of the end, he wanted stamps, book of stamps that the organization sent back to these kids. And then there was a PS. The PS said, just want you to know that last night my Cocker Spaniel became a Christian. You can't buy that right? Another one starts off this way. Would have been about a first grader, tell me the handwriting. Tell Jesus hi for me. The envelopes that came in were extremely interesting too. The addresses, it was in Minneapolis at that time, and the address was very often wrong. And one letter, that envelope I especially liked, which made it, it just said Billy Graham somewhere in the world. Well, it made it. But of those letters that came in, my all-time favorite was one that was correctly addressed, but then down in the lower left, it said, in case of rapture, never mind. So that gives you a sense. I don't have time to go into the people who despised him and wrote in scurrilous letters, but there were some pretty important people that wrote some pretty scurrilous stuff. Very important theologians, fundamentalists, liberals. Bob Jones in 1966 said to the press, Billy Graham is doing more damage to the cause of Jesus Christ than any human alive. There are people on the left who said the same kind of thing. He's doing enormous damage to the country, to civil rights, to the church. And Billy's response to all this is, I cannot respond. He said, if I tried to respond, I'd get nothing else done. So on principle, he simply did not respond. And even to the positive letters, there was a formula kind of answer that came in. I will conclude with this. Bob Dylan, AARP Magazine, 2015. Now I know you're astonished to think that I would be reading AARP Magazine. But it's one of my favorites, okay? And unless you wonder, Bob Dylan is 84 years old. He's still around. This is Bob Dylan, 2015. This is where I quit. The greatest preacher and evangelist of my time was Billy Graham. That guy could save souls, and he did. I went to 2 or 3 of his rallies back in the 50s and 60s. Actually, he's got it wrong, it's in the 80s, but he said, I went to 2 or 3 of his rallies. This guy was like rock and roll personified. He was volatile, explosive. He had the hair, the tone, the elocution. When he spoke, he brought the storm down. Clouds parted. This may be a little bit. Clouds parted. Souls got saved. Sometimes 30 or 40,000 of them. Well, that's an exaggeration too. But the point is that thousands would come forward in these meetings. He said, if you ever went to a Billy Graham rally back then, you were changed forever. There's never been a preacher like him. He could fill a football stadium before anybody. He could fill the Giants stadium more than the Giants could fill their own stadium. Seems like a long time ago. Long before Mick Jagger sang his first note. Long before Bruce Springsteen, I'm sure. Long before Bruce strapped on his first guitar. That's a part of rock and roll that I retained and I remember. I had to. I saw Billy Graham in the flesh, and I heard him loud and clear. Pretty powerful memories from someone who actually, he went through a profound Christian phase, Bob Dylan, but he wrote this and moved on from that, and so I think that's pretty important. Well, that's all I want to say about the man's life. Now we got some time for a few questions, but next week I want to talk about his character, the kind of person who won this kind of popular visibility. Okay, I'm sure you have some questions you want to raise for me. Yeah. Okay, yep. I forgot your name. I'm sorry.
That's right, Rick Dave.
Rick, yeah.
Just curious about his attraction outside of the U.S., particularly you talk about in England in the 50s.
Great question, Rick. And I'm glad you brought it up. And then probably I can't prove this, but probably the largest single gathering of Christians in history took place on a sweltering Sunday afternoon in June of 1972 in Seoul, Korea.
Right.
And there Graham preached, and there they literally had helicopters overhead counting 1,257,000 people live on the airport tarmac. And there's some fantastic pictures from behind, and you can see this as far off in the horizon as you can see human beings. That's Seoul, Korea, and the concluding meeting of a Bible crusade in Seoul. Now, that was atypical, of course, but he did have a notable ministry overseas starting in 1957, and it went on to nearly the end of his career. One anecdote, when I say that, I have to remember, there was a teaching evaluation that came in once for me. It said, we like the class. Grant told a lot of antidotes. All right, so here's an antidote. It says a lot about that international appeal. And that is his final crusade. It was in Flushing Meadows, New York in 2005. At that point, he was approaching 90. That crusade was simultaneously translated, like in the new UN, 27 languages. Now that tells you about the inter-ethnic, the cross-ethnic, But yeah, I would say, if I live long enough, I'm not gonna do this, but if I had a career ahead of me, I would write a book about Graham overseas, because the last third of his career, huge crusades in India, Australia, New Zealand, and in Moscow. He had the major, but he even went to North Korea. Not great pull there, but at least, yeah, good question, yeah. He had his own interpreter. He took his own pulpit with him, the glass shield. He took his own sound man with him, and he took his own interpreters with him. He didn't trust interpreters. And so he had, if you go down the Billy Graham organization today, they have a large auditorium called the Billy Kim Room, and that was his Korean interpreter. They let him everywhere, yeah. Yeah, good question. Anything else you wanna raise about him? Well, I'll tell you one thing we'll talk about next week is Kathy and I had the great privilege of visiting him 4 times in his 90s. And I'd say the first 3 of them, he was lucid. The 4th one, he was in his mid-90s, and he was not lucid. But I mean, for those first 3 visits, I mean, it was a mountaintop experience. You walk into the room, and your charisma, you felt like it was on the wallpaper. Now, if we didn't know it was Billy Graham, would you have that same sense? Well, I don't know, but we did know. And it was just overwhelming to walk in. He had no interest in me, absolutely none. Entire conversation with Kathy. Those Southern gentlemen, he wanted to know about kids, grandkids, wanted to know how, in those days we lived in Chapel Hill, and he said, "Now, tell me, how does this work? You teach at Duke, but you live in Chapel Hill." And he said, "Isn't that a problem?" He liked to joke around. And one of I'll put a quote at this, toward the end, well, he had these dogs, he loved dogs. He had this enormous St. Bernard. St. Bernard probably weighed about 170. Well, this particular Bernie probably weighed 370 pounds. He was immense, okay. And so Billy was telling Kathy about this, that Bernie loved life, and that he was free to go in the kitchen and get a snack whenever he wanted. So Kathy said, well, maybe you shouldn't let him go and get a snack, all the time, So, but it was at that level of the interaction. Those things you do remember, yeah. Well, great. Thank you all for coming, and we'll talk about character next week.
That was great.
Sorry, buddy.
Number 2's not bad either, though.
He did his part.